Hello, my name is Daniel Hampel. I will be addressing the topic of continuing military aid to Ukraine, and I will be taking the side that the U.S. should continue to support Ukraine in this effort. I want to caveat this and say that the condition for such military aid should be contingent upon a clear definition of an end goal, and that such military aid should be in support to bringing about that end goal as quickly as possible. So before I jump into specifics, I want to start with an ideal and then work back into the context and current position of Ukraine and Russia. So to start, we should recognize the power dynamics that exist between a superpower nation and the satellite nations within its sphere of influence. So by superpower here, I mean those nations that have relatively stable economies, large GDPs, strong military capacity, relatively large populations, and cultural influence. So my first premise is, and the ideal that I want to represent here, is that superpowers have the responsibility to acknowledge and protect human rights, popular self-determination, and expressions of national sovereignty of less powerful nations. This responsibility is particularly critical when it comes to the case of fellow superpower nations violating those rights of less powerful nations. So my second premise is that through its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has demonstrated a severe derogation of this responsibility, and my conclusion, therefore, is that other powerful nations should then support operations to end the invasion and discourage future activities as such. So for the first premise, my ideal, that is just a recognition of how superpowers can easily destabilize regions when intervening in a way that reflects their own interests instead of the rights and sovereignty of the nation in which they are interfering. With the U.S., we can see this in cases like the Contras in Nicaragua or ISIS in Iraq. So my ideal is one of enforcing the rules-based international order in which superpowers must commit to preserve, to the greatest degree feasible, smaller nations' human rights, popular self-determination, and national sovereignty. So for my second premise is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine represents a clear violation of such an international order, and this is made evident in how Ukraine has been postured since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Much is made about the expansion of NATO provoking Russia into an invasion. However, what's often ignored in these discussions is how the nations that joined in each round of expansion largely joined of their own accord, and often in the face of Russian hegemonic policies. For instance, we see in the expansion in which the Baltic states joined NATO that there had been economic repression like energy sanctions from Russia in order to keep them under their influence. So while NATO expansion presents as a threat to Russia, we have to remember that it expanded in the first place because those smaller nations saw an alliance with Western nations as preferable to being in a bloc in which Russia could still exercise control. As an illustration, imagine if the current administration that we have in the U.S. Imposed all of the tariffs it was talking about on Mexico, and it attempted to take over Panama. And in the face of this, Central American nations joined together as a coalition, maybe backed by China, to repel U.S. aggression. Undoubtedly, the U.S. would recognize the threat of such a coalition that it would face for our national security, but the U.S. would only have itself to blame for that coalition developing in the first place. Similarly to the expansion of NATO, it also represents the Europeans' desire for enhanced security, precisely because they don't trust Russia. As recently as last year, there have been consistent calls from Ukrainians to join NATO. Polling in 2023 and 2024 consistently put Ukrainian public support for joining NATO around 80%. So to insinuate the admission of Ukraine or any other European nations to NATO as some kind of imperialism or as an act by the West to destroy Russia is to deny those recent NATO members' own expressions of sovereignty. If Russia wants to get to the root of why so many of its neighbors don't trust it, Putin may want to start by looking in a mirror. So in conclusion, through its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has demonstrated that it is not interested in such an international order as I have described. Therefore, I would say that it is the responsibility of other nations, like the United States, to work to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukrainian people's right to self-determination. So they should repel the invasion, work to end the conflict, and then set the conditions that discourage similar violations of sovereignty in the future. So that's all I have to say, so thank you very much for listening.